Namo Namaha and welcome back. So now that we get a kind of an intuitive sense of how the past passive participles work, these ktahas or bhute, let's talk about how to form them off of your verb roots. The main focus in this segment should be on being able to recognize and identify ktahas and the roots that they come from. And as you do that over time, you'll start to naturally absorb and get a knowledge of more and more PPPs. You shouldn't try to learn every single PPP in the language all at once. The formation of the past passive participle is straightforward. You take a verb root and you weaken it. You take its 0 grade form. This is basically the same that we saw in the passive construction, the karmani prayoga, also in the gerunds, the twantas. The PPPs are going to behave like those, but of course they're going to have their own special oddities and quirks and idiosyncrasies. Anyway, you take the 0 grade weakened root and then you add an optional infix known as your it. Right? Again, whether root takes the it or not depends on if it's a set root, vet root, or unit root, and mostly you have to learn these as you go. After your optional infix, your it, then you add the suffix the. This is your characteristic marker of the PPP, and then you're done, actually, right? What you've got is an adjective that ends in the letter a. This is your PPP, and then you make it agree in gender, number, and case with whatever is the object of your verb. You can think of the basic meaning of the PPP as X was done to it. So eaten, drunk, read, stolen, seen, thought, cooked. These are all past passive participles that tell you about what action was done to the object. And so that's basically it as far as morphology goes. It's pretty straightforward. The challenge with PPPs is going to be internal sandhi. When you have your the suffix and it gets smashed right onto the root, then unpredictable sandhi stuff happens. What we'll do here is go through a bunch of PPPs to start with to keep in mind. A general rule of thumb is that whenever you learn a new verb, try to learn both the present tense conjugation as well as the PPP, the bhute kridanta or the ktaha, because then you'll be able to recognize both in a sentence, and often they don't look alike. Anyway, the way to form your PPP, once you form your PPP, then you make it behave like any other adjective. When you use it, it'll take on the gender of whatever noun it's going with. It'll take on the case or vibhakti of that noun and its number, whether it's singular, dual, or plural. So for example, if we had the root kad, to eat, it does take your infix and we get the PPP kadita, meaning eaten. Suppose a fruit was eaten, we would say palam kaditam. The fruit was eaten. If we said vanarena palam kaditam, it would mean the fruit was eaten by the monkey. Two things that are worth noting here. One, if the verb is intransitive, meaning that it doesn't have a direct object, it's akarmaka, then the PPP will agree directly with the subject. In other words, the PPP actually can work as an active in an active sense, even though it's a passive participle technically. For example, the root has, meaning to laugh, has your PPP hasita. It has that optional e. It means laughed. So if we said Sita hasita, this means Sita laughed. Sita is the agent of the laughing. She's not the one being laughed at. This is just something to watch out for in terms of your intransitive verbs, is that the PPPs function actively. Another thing to watch out for is with the verbs of motion. Remember, verbs like gum, to go, ya, also to go, will take direct objects. Ramaha vanam gacchati. Rama goes to the forest. When we use the PPP for these verbs, it can create some confusion. The PPP can agree either with the agent, the person who's doing the motion, or the destination, the place where they're going. So for gum, the PPP is gata, and we could either say Ramena vanam gatam, which would mean the forest was gone to by Rama, or we could say Ramaha vanam gataha. Rama went to the forest. Both are fine. Both are acceptable. The same thing can happen with verbs of speaking, like bhash, for example, which means speak or say, bhashate. The PPP of Bhash is Bhashita. It has that E again. And it can agree either with what's being said or the person who's being addressed. So you can say Ramena Gajaha Bhashitaha. This means the elephant was spoken to by Rama. But if we said Ramena Gajaya Vakyam Bhashitam, this means that a sentence was said, Vakyam Bhashitam, to the elephant, for the elephant, Gajaya, by Rama, Ramena. It's very confusing, but it's something to watch out for in the wild world of the PPPs, this flexibility that it has. Okay, so with that, let's spend some time running through some examples of roots and their PPPs. Like with gerunds and with all kinds of these things, the best way to approach the task of learning is inductively. Learn as you encounter these PPPs and practice being able to identify the roots from which PPPs come. The more you practice, the better you'll get at this. Here are a few general patterns that are good to be aware of to start with. First, for most roots, you just add your ta suffix to the unmodified weak form of the root. So for the root kru, to do, to make, we get kruta as your PPP, done or made. Vadaha krutaha, a dispute was made. Vadaha, masculine. Yuddham krutam, war was made. It's in the neuter. Shanti kruta, peace was made in the feminine. Other roots ending in vocalic R will behave like kru. So hru, hruta, stolen, taken away. Mru, to die, mruta, dead. Dhr, to hold, bear, becomes dhruta, held or borne up. Smru, to remember, smruta, remembered. Same goes with most verbs ending in vowels. Ya, to go, becomes yata, gone. Jna, to know, becomes jnata, known. Bhu becomes bhuta, became. Shru, hear, to becomes shruta, heard. Hu, offer, huta, offered. Pu, purified, puta, cleansed or purified. Some roots will take the optional I infix. Most roots ending in retroflexes, for example, will take this it. So pat, to read or study, becomes patita, studied, read. Ramena pustakam patitam, the book was read by Rama. If a root ends in a consonant cluster, this also takes your I infix. One example is chumb, meaning to kiss. This turns into chumbita, kissed. Balakaha, matra chumbitaha, the boy was kissed by his mother. Roots ending in an unvoiced aspirate, as well as the roots la or wa, will also take this I infix. Lik, to write, becomes likita, written. Chal, meaning to move or walk, becomes chalita, moved or walked. Jeev, which means to live, becomes jivita, lived or enlivened. In situations where the it is not added, roots ending in consonants will create odd sandhi rules, of course, sometimes making it hard to figure out actually what root the PPP comes from. Drush, for example, to see, will turn into drushta. Ramena gajaha drushtaha. The elephant was seen by Rama. Here the dental takara forces first the unstable palatal sha to jump down to a retroflex shakara. Of course, there's no velar sibilant to jump up to. Then the dental ta is simultaneously also dragged up to the retroflex ta, so you get drishta. The root bud, meaning to wake up, become knowledgeable, has an important PPP worth learning. When we add the ta suffix, this ta first gains voicing and aspiration to match the dhakara at the end of bud. So we have bud, dha. But then, since we can't have the cluster with two aspirates, da, right? The first one will lose the aspiration, and we end up with buddha. And you may have heard of this fellow, the enlightened one, the awakened Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. That's where his name comes from. Another interesting palatal sandhi is for the root yuj, meaning to yoke, harness, control. When you add the PPP marker ta, then this palatal ja, because it's radioactive palatals again, will jump up now to the velar, and we end up with yukta, joined, controlled, yoked, united. Bhuj, to eat or enjoy, works the same way, and we get bhukta, eaten, enjoyed. Ramena annam bhuktam, the rice was eaten by Rama. Another thing to remember is that the roots will experience regular weakening or downgrading. So if there's an infixed nasal, you'll drop the nasal. Bund tie or bind, for example, will first downgrade just to bud. Then we get then we add our suffix ta. We'll get the same kind of aspiration sandhi jumping that we saw in the case of bud da, right? And here it becomes bud da, tied, bound. Bund, bud da. That's the PPP. Another example of this is stumb, which means to stand steady or freeze in place. To make the PPP, the root will first downgrade to stub. Then you add your ta. The same aspiration migration happens. First, the ta suffix becomes da to match the voice and aspiration of the root. Then the aspiration of the ba is lost because you can't have ba da. And so you get stub da, which means stood still or frozen in place. Another similar aspiration situation is when verbs end in the hakara, the letter H. Here, often the ha will first turn into a voiced aspirate velar, the ga-gara. It's very strange. For the root da, for example, to burn, we get dag-da, burnt. Agninavanam dag-dam, the forest was burnt by the fire. The sandhi here is that the root first becomes dug, then this forces the ta to become da, the voiced aspirate version, to match the voiced aspirate ga, but the ga now loses its aspiration and we end up with dug da. The same thing's going to happen with the root duh, to milk. This becomes dug da, milked. Incidentally, dugdam just means milk, the noun. Sometimes the roots ending in H, other bizarre sandhi will take place where they'll combine to form a retroflexed aspirate da, and the vowel lengthens. So, for example, lih to lick turns into lida, licked. Ruh to climb or mount becomes rudha, climbed or mounted. Sa to endure or suffer through something turns into, oddly enough, sodha, suffered through or endured. Wa to carry along will become wodha, carried along. These are strange PPPs, and you'll just have to learn them as you see them and start to make a mental association with the roots from which they come from, with these H final roots. Another common weakening we already saw in the passives and the gerunds is the loss of a final nasal in roots that end in un or right? So gum to go becomes gata, gone. Num to bow becomes nata, bowed. Yum to hold or control becomes yata, held or controlled. Ram to enjoy, to take delight or pleasure becomes rata, to take taken delight or pleasure. Hun to kill becomes hata, killed. Man turns into mata, thought. Another regular change that we see with the PPP is also found in our passives and gerunds, and this is the process of Sambrasarana, or semi-vowel downgrading. Here again, a number of roots that start with the syllables wa or ya are subject to turn into the corresponding semi-vowels u or i. The most common one to remember, of course, is vach, to say or speak. This is going to turn into uch, but with our ta suffix is going to become ukta, meaning said or spoken. Ramena vakyam uktam. A sentence, vakyam, was said by Rama. Remember, we can also have it agree with the person being addressed. Sita Ramena ukta. Sita was spoken to by Rama, meaning Rama spoke to Sita. Another example is vas, to live in or dwell in. This is also going to downgrade to ush now, but it's going to also have your optional e suffix, so we end up with ushita, lived in or dwelled in. Ramena vanam ushitam. The forest was lived in by Rama. Another example is yaj, to sacrifice. This will have the same kind of downgrading, but it gets a bit irregular. Yaj turns into ish with the retroflex sibilants shakara rather than ij. So we get ishta, sacrificed. Like with the passive roots, some roots ending in a will do strange things. Some turn into a long e in the weakening. The most common of these is pa, to drink, becomes pita, drunk. Ashwena jalam pitam, the water was drunk by the horse. Sometimes the a will turn into a short e. Stha, meaning to stand or stay, becomes sthita, stood or stayed. Ashwaha marge sthitaha, the horse stood in the road. Notice how here the intransitive PPP will agree with the agent, the horse who's doing the standing, not the road, which is where the horse is doing the standing. Dha, to put or place, becomes hita, put or placed. That's just a form you'll have to recognize. Hita, it's very important PPP. It has a frozen meaning of meaning benefit or good. The most important one to remember, though, is the irregular PPP of da, which means to give, and it becomes datta, given. Kanyaya vanaraya palam dattam. The fruit was given, palam dattam, by the girl to the monkey. Kanyaya vanaraya. You'll see datta everywhere. Aside from these, there are a number of odd situations where the ta suffix will actually turn into a nasal na. These you just have to learn to recognize. They're not obvious at all. The verb tr, for example, to cross, turns into tirna, crossed. The verb pr, meaning to fill up, turns into purna, meaning full or filled. The verb li, which means cling, turns into lina, clung to, attached to. The verb ha, which means to forsake or quit or abandon, turns into hina, abandoned, forsaken, quitted. To make things even more complicated, when roots end in the dental voiced dakara, they're going to assimilate to the nasal n, and we end up with a double na. So chid, to cut, becomes chinna, cut or split. Bid, break or split, turns into binna, broken or split apart. Bud, to fall, turns into panna, fallen. So maybe this will give you a good sense to start off with of both of the simplicity and the complexities involved in the formation of your PPPs, your ktaha or bhute krudantas, the past passive participle. Again, the best strategy is not to memorize every single rule, every single case, but rather to get a broad sense of what PPPs look like in the wild, and then as you see them in your readings or in your exercises, start associating them in your head with the verb roots from which they come from and the meanings. For the verb roots, it's best to learn two things. When you learn the root, learn its present conjugation and its PPP. Learning to recognize these two things will help you read faster. It'll help you get the basic structures and meanings of sentences down much quicker. And slowly, you'll start to be able to gain more and more confidence as we go further in this world of Sanskrit. So let's take a break here, and when we come back, we'll look at the flip side of actually what we just learned, a form called the ktavatu in Sanskrit, the past active participle. Until then, thank you for watching. See you next time. Punarmilamaha. Dhanyavadaha.